Okay, welcome, folks, for our Hanger podcast episode where we talk about everything related to developer experience. Today, with us, we have Chris. Chris joining from HTEC, and we are really excited to learn about Chris's journey and talk about everything related to metrics. So, Chris, please start with a short introduction, and then we will get going.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and look forward to the conversation here. So, I am the senior director of kind of engineering effectiveness at HTEC, and I have been around kind of the developer experience effectiveness world for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. I kind of remember all the way back to Six Sigma days, and just like, how do you take and really solve people's problems through platforms and through platform and system thinking. And that's really what kind of led me into this space. And, I really, I like to help clients just solve and remove kind of the toil that developers have to go through to really, kind of get things out of the way. And, an interesting stat that I always like to talk about at first is, I forget the exact numbers, but 70 something % of all developers are burnt out. Yet the vast majority of them code on the weekends. And so it has nothing to do with the act of coding. It has everything to do with the environment and kind of that operational kind of inertia that you have to fight through a day-to-day basis. And big fan of the space. And like I said, really glad to be here.
So, Chris, I saw you also worked at ThoughtWorks before, and now you're at HTEC. Let's share a bit more about with the audience. What do you mean by developer experience? Kind of like, how does it work in these two different organizations? I understand both of these organizations are focused on helping other companies succeed with developer experience, for instance, like that's kind of your domain. How do different companies, operate and think about it? Are there differences in ThoughtWorks and HTEC's way of operating for developer experience?
Yeah, I think kind of HTEC and ThoughtWorks are a little bit the same because they're both consulting companies. But we see a lot of differences in kind of the clients that we work with, and there are kind of your tech forward folks that are early adopters in a lot of ways, and they tend to be a little bit more tech forward, a little more process forward, a little more willing and eager to kind of take on the new buzzword of the day to try to make things better. But then there's a lot of the kind of more lagging folks, maybe not like on the far side of that bell curve, but people that are moving up that bell curve a little bit. And, those are actually the people that I really love to work with because they're generally pretty open to ideas. They know they need help and generally are trying to come at things from a good place. The interesting thing is they all came from somewhere different, and in kind of considering that all companies are now software companies, there's a lot of people that are having to learn how to write custom software that have really never had a chance to do it before. And, being able to go in there and say, hey, here's what some good practices looks like. Here's how we can help you kind of evolve and rethink about engineering in a different way. And, kind of do that over time and be able to kind of slowly deliver that is really what I enjoy. And, I spent 4 years at ThoughtWorks. I still love those guys. But we both kind of do the same thing, but a lot of the clients are really different.
Amazing. Given that we're talking about a lot of new buzzwords coming up, well, we're not going to talk about AI yet, but even kind of like, we started at some point talking about developer productivity, like not in this conversation, but like in the software engineering world. And we talk now also about developer experience. From your perspective, are they the same things? Are they related? Or are there kind of like core differences that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And there's a lot of people, and I'll say this in a short time, that developer productivity and developer experience and engineering effectiveness are all essentially the same thing. They're all trying to kind of reduce that waste and friction. But in a longer answer, I would say, I have this kind of formula that I talk about that I call a developer productivity formula. But in the end, it's developer productivity is what you want. But what does it take to get there? So you have your developer experience, you have your developer satisfaction, then you have your organizational waste and friction. So you basically you sum those up. And then you times all of that by collaboration. And that's really what kind of goes into your developer experience, because you can have a really great experience, but if your developers are just absolutely hate the people they work for and they hate the environment, you're probably not going to get a lot of productivity. If you have a good experience, but you have no way to collaborate, you're still not going to get productivity. And so it really takes that kind of thinking to be able to, like, that to me is the formula. And then underneath that, you have kind of people, process, and technology. And those are the inputs into those problems of, okay, well, some of that waste and friction might be a people problem, might be a process problem, could be a technology problem, rarely, but it could be. And to me, when I think about, kind of engineering effectiveness or developer productivity or developer experience, it's about cleaning those processes, whether process or people or technology. It's about optimizing those things to drive a better overall experience that will then make happier developers that hopefully will to lead to better collaboration. And then in the end, you get better productivity. There's a lot of thought in the market right now that, what engineering organizations actually need is faster typers. And I don't believe that to be true. Like, developer productivity does not equal faster typers. It is cleaning up the rest of the things that are in that formula. And that's the hard stuff that you have to go through to clean up to be able to actually truly get better productivity.
Interesting. So I'm going to also double click a little bit on this, where now we're talking about developer productivity. Obviously there is concepts of measuring it, which I also, in this conversation would be the core of our conversation, is metrics. There are at least 50 companies out there who build different types of productivity or developer experience metrics. As an engineering leader, engineering manager, how do people, adopt different tools? Like, how should people think about different, metrics, different signals? Is there like some sort of like method to the madness when there are, in some ways, overload of these tools for every organization, right? Like, I mean, you can possibly measure even bathroom breaks of developers. I understand like there's also Dora metrics, which is sort of like a little bit more standardized, measuring your delivery performance. But like, even if you go one level beyond Dora metrics, there isn't as well-defined metrics or standardizations, or like, everyone is trying to slice and dice a different way. So yeah, like, how do you think leaders should think about metrics?
So great question. So I break it down. So there's a couple of major problems. One, there is no one size fits all. And so you have to think about metrics in the different layers of an organization. So your CTO and C-suite is going to need a different set of metrics than your engineering leaders. That is going to need a different set of metrics than your engineering managers. And so how do you think about those personas to give them exactly what they need? And so if I think about a kind of CTO or C-suite, they're going to want that high level kind of index. Like, what's the directionality of a certain set of things? And you should also think about them through a push and pull mechanism. So at that level, I like to think about cost, speed, and quality. And I like to call that the development triangle, because of that triangle, you get to pick two and the other one gets dictated for you. And so there's a natural push and pull to it. And a lot of people, whether consciously or subconsciously, say, well, I want it fast and I want it at a low cost. Okay, great. Well, then you are going to get a lower quality, unless you start to remove waste and friction that then allow people to be able to work in that faster way, which takes investment. And so by thinking about those three, kind of directional metrics, you can start to understand how well your engineering organization is doing and understand that push and pull. So at that level, that's a lot of what you should care about, and probably things like weekly time loss or something like that. But you take that next step down to that engineering leadership layer, that's where I believe like Dora metrics will come in. What are some of the cycle times? And, well, I actually prefer kind of the space metrics. There's other people that have some other frameworks out there, like, DX as a core 4. And then there's a few other folks that have different metric sets out there. And, at that layer, you're needing activity-based metrics, but you're also needing qualitative-based metrics. So what is the sentiment that people feel about a certain thing? So this kind of goes back to that, kind of formula that I was talking about of, you have your experience, but then you have that sentiment. How do developers feel? And so you need to be able to quantitatively measure and say, great, well, this is what it looks like through the output. But this, through qualitative, you're going to understand what the problems actually are. Because if you think quantitatively and go, oh, well, this team has a deployment frequency of 5 per week. This one has a deployment frequency of 5 per day. Is one better than the other? The answer is maybe. I can argue yes and no, depending on the exact scenario. And so you don't have enough information there to truly be able to compare. But if you start to be able to break things down qualitatively through some type of survey, you can now understand the challenges people are facing inside of a certain set of problems. So, I can see through my quantitative data that this team has a strikingly different set of data than that team. Well, now I can take that next step down and say, oh, well, they're having a problem with their CI/CD pipelines because they're leveraging X, Y, or Z. And now you can start to say, okay, well, I used my lagging indicator to understand directionality. I can use that qualitative data to understand what the problem might be. Now, to me, the next step is those kind of leading indicators that say, all right, well, what is the thing that I want to attach to this initiative to be able to start to track, is it getting better or getting worse? And so, maybe it's PR review times. I know that's right up your alley. And how do you track those, right? And for me, the way you get away from metrics overload is by stopping measuring things once you don't need them anymore. So you have your directionality that says, hey, I care about these DORA metrics. I care about my qualitative metrics. And then I found this problem, and I'm going to start to measure it until it falls out of the band in which I care. Like, okay, well, this thing's too low, it's too high, it's weird. Now I can track it until it's back into a kind of a steady state, and then just stop measuring it. Because if in the end, if you get 5 years down the road and you just keep measuring this and measuring that, measuring this and measuring that, all of a sudden you have a dashboard of 100 metrics. And it looks like the stock market. Half of them have gone up, half of them have gone down, half of them are sideways. And you look at it and go, what is this? What is this telling me? And the answer is nothing. It's telling you absolutely nothing. And so you have to be more clinical about how you think about your metrics if you truly want to identify these key areas and be able to actually affect change and not drive yourself crazy in the end.
Interesting. That's actually the first time I'm hearing this. This is a very interesting idea of you kind of like have almost a lifetime of every metric or every initiative that you're working on, and you kind of like stop measuring or at least stop focusing on those things and move on to others.
Well, you need your base metrics, just to be clear. Like you need, what are the 4 or 5, maybe they're DORA metrics, maybe they're not. There was a really interesting article, I think Pragmatic Engineer did it. I don't remember. I think it was him. He put out an article around the 17 kind of tech companies and the metrics that they care about. And they're all different because they're optimizing for the things that they care about. And these are the core set of 4, 5, maybe 6, but probably not. Like these are the metrics that we care about. These are the core. And then you tack on those other ones that have a limited life cycle. And all of them have a team focused around gathering these metrics, identifying them, leveraging them through initiatives. And then almost all of them tend to fall off and say, okay, well, I don't care about this anymore. Great. Now let's think about the next thing. Let's improve the next thing. Let's improve the next thing. And it's that pruning that will help you from not having a 25-person metric team.
So do you think it is related to the maturity of the devx function that these metrics, essentially what I'm trying to understand is if somebody's just starting with creating a devx team, right? Like maybe they just got to like 30, 40, 50 developers and they're like, oh, things have started slowing down. At least there's a perception of it. Do you think most people will start from one place and slowly graduate and move towards like, in some ways, greener world? Or do you think everyone has their own path and journey?
That's a really good question. And it's relatively philosophical. Like we're all developing custom software, yet we all have our different little slice of how to do it. And I think this is one of the reasons why like standardized metric or frameworks of almost any kind tend to not work is because they're not that you need everything kind of custom built for you, but it has to feel like yours. And if it's, and I think the agile movement fell really victim of this, of like, you should do this. And this is exactly how you should do it. It's like, yeah, but we don't really operate that way. Well, yeah, but you should make this work anyway. And so I don't think that, those solid kind of frameworks work. You have to kind of make it your own. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of kind of what I was just laying out is like, yeah, DORA metrics are great. Space metrics are great. But what are the things that you want to optimize for and the directionality that you want to understand? Like of those 17 companies, and some of them seem to care more about developer sentiment. Like we want to have happy developers, right? And if you have happy developers do good things. And that's kind of what they believe. And so they track, one of them is actually called developer happiness, I think is their metric. And others tend to more care about kind of throughput metrics. And both of those are okay. It's just what is the thing that you want to leverage? And, in my mind, it almost doesn't matter. It just needs to be your thing that everybody can buy into. And that's the most important part.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit. We want to talk about how can metrics go wrong? Have you had examples, especially as you talk to different companies, different clients, where you have to educate people about metrics, where you saw people were measuring the wrong metrics?
Yeah, there's two major things that I'll bring up for this. So one of them is, nobody likes to be micromanaged and nobody should be micromeasured. And there's a lot of people that fall victim to to trying to micromeasure. And to me, that is it's almost impossible to do because there's a lot of people that, well, not a lot. There's a handful of people that will tell you that you can directly measure productivity of a developer. I don't believe that to be true in almost any way. Like you can measure waste and friction, you can measure cycle times, you can measure those kinds of things. But directly measuring productivity to me is like asking how long is a piece of string. It's very difficult to try to figure out. And so, if you're, that's why I like going back to kind of what I was saying a minute ago of dropping measures when you're done with them and giving people things that they should care about and they should care about now. It needs to be actionable. The second part of that is, what are you trying to be as an engineering organization? Are you trying to be innovative? Or are you trying to crank out widgets? And, there was a talk I gave a while ago called something along the lines of, is software development the next blue collar job? And that is the point behind that was, if you're just truly trying to crank out widgets and measure how fast you can crank out widgets, then you're going to get generic widgets is what you're going to get. You're going to get things that are probably low quality, that are error prone, and are just not very unique. And are you as a company trying to actually be innovative and drive change into the market, be a market leader and those kinds of things? Then your metric framework and how you treat the people on your engineering teams directly impacts that. And I am a firm believer that software engineering is a creative endeavor, not a coming in and cranking the machine to grind out more Java code. It goes all the way to, this kind of leans into the cultural aspect of it, but, metrics can drive that kind of culture if you're not careful. It's another reason why I say drop the metrics you're not using anymore. If you don't care about them, nobody should care about them until you've identified another reason to care. And so if you can keep that simple, keep it focused, and say that these are the goals that we're trying to hit as an organization, this is the impact that we're trying to deliver with our products and what we're delivering, and then being able to convey that in a way that says, These are the metrics we care about. We're doing this with you, not against you. Now let's figure out how do we remove that waste and friction and make it easier for you to live and operate on a day-to-day basis. Like, outside of that, like, I know I didn't directly answer your question because I firmly believe everybody's different. Those goals are different, so the metrics are different. But those are the problems in which I see happen a lot inside of organizations. You have this kind of tight fist of like, yes, but I need to squeeze out another 5% productivity. Well, okay, like, I hear you, but the way to do that is not by adding in more management.
Can you give like specific example? I mean, we don't need to cover like all examples, but like one example would be helpful to understand, kind of like put this in perspective.
Sure. So I have been working with a particular client that has to get 10% productivity gain. So that's the thing that they have to get. Okay. That's the measure. That is the metric that they are being held to. And so how do you want to do that? Like, how do you measure it? And then how do you get to it? And so the way that you measure it, in my opinion, is by measuring cycle times. And what I mean by cycle times is, take this particular set of problems, take documentation, for example. It's super easy to poke fingers at documentation. Everybody has a major problem with it. But you can do something as basic as a calculation of how many questions does a developer have? How long does it take them to get it answered? And then how many other people do they have to bother to get this question answered? Well, okay, well, you can start to now do some calculations on that says, and this is how many hours it's going to take this person. And if you have 1,000 developers inside of your organization, you can start to extrapolate out how much time is lost through that particular problem. And that is a set problem that you can now speak to everybody in the C-suite will understand that this is the problem. It's costing this amount of hours. That translates into this number of millions of dollars in waste. And so you can't necessarily say, I am measuring their productivity. What I can measure is how much waste is there. So now, okay, well, for every, like, if I can reduce the number of questions a developer has from 5 to 3, okay, great. Well, I have now saved a bunch of time. The question after that comes, well, how do I realize those savings? Like, that's a totally different question of, well, depends on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to fire a bunch of people? Are you trying to scale? Are you trying to build a better culture? There's a bunch of ways that you can try to remediate that, but that is a common metric that you can leverage for almost any type of problem inside of an engineering organization. And it will bridge the technical and non-technical gap.
Interesting.
And like, that to me is the only metric that matters for anybody outside of technology. Like, okay, well, what are the dollars? So if you go to your CFO and say, hey, I need $1 million to do a developer experience initiative to help improve technical documentation, blah, 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 blah. Like, they're going to say, oh, well, well, that's a big investment that I don't see an ROI on. Well, how do you build that ROI calculation? Is through this type of kind of cycles and thinking. And the biggest problem with all of this is it's not easy. And so what a lot of people want is, oh, just give me this framework. Just give me this easy button. I can just, plug in, I can drop an agent into there and it's just going to spit out all these metrics. And it's like, yeah. Like, that's great. But you need somebody to actually action upon that. Because another interesting quote that I had from a CTO last week was that these metrics, I don't care about them at all. The thing that I care about is business impact. These metrics are a mean to an end, so that's why I care about them. But in the end, I don't care. I just need to build better, faster, quicker. And so, it goes back to the point of don't fall in love with your dashboard because the dashboard doesn't care.
So just to summarize kind of like some of those things, I really like this idea. It's like, many people and many organizations end up measuring things which are easy to measure rather than things which are more impactful.
Yeah. And that's how you end up with 100 metrics on the dashboard, right? Because they're easy to measure. And, that stuff, it generally doesn't matter in the end.
So kind of like maybe diving into a slightly different angle, which is Goodhart's law, which says is like when a measure becomes a target, it no longer is a good measure. I think more specifically, like there are like certain metrics which I'm always questioning about as well. Like, so a couple of things I was talking to you earlier about is like, wait time for builds, right? Sure, like a wait time for builds is long for teams. Does that like directly correlate with their developer productivity? Because in some ways, a developer is not just like, twitching thumbs, waiting for the builds to finish, right? If the wait time is long, they'll probably move on to other things. What's your, and kind of like similar things can also apply to code reviews. What's your take on that?
This is a really good example of why this stuff's hard, and why you can't just look at some of the metrics that you can easily spit out from, a CI/CD tool or whatever. Is because in the end, do build times matter? Maybe not. Maybe they do, and it depends on what build time you're talking about. Like, if you're talking about a scenario where CI and CD are different, and my CD build times, no one probably cares about. They're running in the background and they're doing their thing, and they're managed by the platform team and whatever. Like, they're just queued up and there's no humans waiting. But if you talk about local build times, now that's a whole different story. But those are a lot harder to gather data on, because what does your local environment look like? And how are you running off of a machine that's from 2001 that can barely run Docker? I don't know, maybe. Do you not have an environment that you can actually check dependencies, or can you run your security scans locally? Like, what are the things that you could and should do? And then again, build times aren't enough information. Because if you have the ability to run like a Sonar Cube or a Sneak locally, if you have the ability to run linters and those kinds of things locally, if you can check and build, do those things inside of your build to check those things locally, that might be okay. Having a 10-minute build time might be okay, but it might not be. And so what is it that you're trying to optimize for is always the question that I have before you get to the metric. Because build time, I can make a case that a build time of an hour is totally fine, and a build case of 5 minutes is terrible. Because again, 5 minutes locally, you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs, or maybe 5 minutes is whatever. But like if it's 25 minutes, and your machine's sitting there about smoking and catching on fire because it's trying to do a build, like that's frustrating. And if you think about the downstream impact of long local build times, what happens? You end up with bigger PRs. You end up with everything just bloats. You end up with longer lived branches. You end up with all of these other things that come up from that. Then you have merge conflicts. You have all of the downstream impacts that actually the root of it was poor local environments. And so that goes back to a little bit of what I was talking about before of you need the quantitative data, but you have to have that qualitative data, because in a good developer experience survey, you should be asking them like, hey, like, how's your local environment like set up? Is that going all right for you? And that's when they should be putting you on blast of, no, this thing's terrible and I can't get anything done. And then you can start to quantify that of like, okay, well, if I have this developer and you can start to say that, okay, well, the average developer costs $80 an hour. They're sitting there waiting for 20 minutes. They have literally nothing they can do because they're working remotely. Now, every time they hit build, great, there's 20 minutes lost, 20 minutes lost. And then you can actually start to say, well, what are they probably going to do? They're probably going to ping their buddy on Slack to say, hey, man, how's it going? Like, what you up to? Like, just sitting here waiting for my build to build. And then now they're distracting them, and then they're distracting somebody else. And all of a sudden you have this cascading problem that, if you looked at just quantitative data, you could say, yeah, our build times are long, but then these other problems are happening, and it's going to be hard to link that back. And so by really doing, kind of the qualitative and quantitative and value stream analysis and digging in, that's where you really start to find that level of gold.
That's a very interesting perspective. Let's take another example. So almost unanimously, every engineer in the world complains about slow code reviews. No matter how many systems and processes you have, no matter what, whether you're an elite organization or sort of like an old school organization, doesn't matter. But improving code reviews comes with a double-edged sword, right? Like if you think about a collective time of code reviews, and if you say this is a metric we want to improve, developers are going to just start like, rubber stamping, approved. There you go. You have reviews done in 10 seconds. How can, like, one is, what is that even a good metric to measure? And two is like, if it is, then how should people think about it?
Well, that goes back to Goodhart's law that you were talking about a second ago.
Yes.
Like once that becomes a thing, people will game it because that's what they're incentivized to do. And there's the Cobra problem in India, which I'm sure I don't know if you've ever heard that story before, but they had a really bad Cobra problem. And then so the government said, hey, we'll give everybody, we'll give you money if you turn in Cobras. And so guess what happened? People started farming and basically, growing Cobras to turn them in because it was a money source. Then the government figured it out. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to keep paying people for Cobras. And then guess what? The Cobra problem was even worse than it was before they started. The same thing applies in PR reviews or in any other thing. And, to have for any metric, you should really have an opposing metric. And, what I mean by that is like, a good example is incident response times, because there's a good kind of counterbalance to it. So say incident response times are an hour. It takes about an hour to get them. Well, if you said, well, I want to bring it down to 10 minutes. Well, you can do that in a bunch of different ways. You can just hire a bunch of people to sit there and wait for an incident to happen. And so all of a sudden, yeah, you lowered your incident response time, but your cost is now quadruple, which doesn't make any sense. And so, having that kind of positive and negative, kind of metric will really help towards driving some of that. And PR review times, it's like, okay, well, we want PR reviews to go down, but we don't want them to go down too much. So there should be a lower value to that. It's like, okay, well, if we're reviewing PRs in 10 minutes, that seems to be a problem. Then you also want to have quality things attached to that. Change failure rate should be another thing that you can look at. And like, how many escaped defects, like all of that should be tied together to say, well, yeah, I want PR reviews to go down, but these other things can't go up in kind of a meaningful way. And so, kind of like I started with that C-suite, you need that push and pull. And, so by designing these kind of initiatives and thinking about it, you'll end up, with better results without having some of the negative impacts. And you're, trying to, how do you get away from Goodhart's law? But there's other, I like to group them. And so like, if you think about PR review times, great. Well, what if you were to slice it down by how many people on the team actually do reviews? Because it should, is it one? Do you have a team of 8? God forbid. And only one person's doing code reviews? Like, okay, well, that's a problem. Like, why? Like, does somebody have a God complex that they're the only one that can do PRs? Well, that's a problem. Like, how do you start to cycle people into there? Is the code so complex that they're the only one that actually understands it? Like, and so, when thinking about the problem of review times, or really of anything, there is, you need people to think about the design of that initiative and the metrics that go along with it to be able to truly drive the results that you would hope to get.
Interesting. I know we are coming close to time. We are already over time, actually. Maybe one takeaway for people, anyone who's listening to this conversation, what is one thing you would recommend they should either do differently or think about or like take away when they're thinking about improving developer experience or maybe just getting started?
So, I talk to a lot of different people that will come to me and say something along the lines of like, I did this blank thing. I did this thing and nobody cares and nobody wants to adopt it. There's like an adoption problem of like, oh, well, we built this really great CI/CD pipelines and blah, 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 blah. Nobody wants to use it. And it's like, okay, well, I have this kind of principle of like, if you have an adoption problem, you did it wrong. And, there is a level of empathy that you have to bring to developer experience. You need to listen, you need to gather information, you need to understand their problem, and kind of get down to the root of it, like we were talking about. Like, what's the real challenge here? And some of those are kind of team level problems that can be solved, and some of them are organizational level problems that need to be solved. Like, hey, my Jira sucks. Okay, great. Well, there's probably nothing you can do about that, like, or whatever, right? There's those different types of challenges, and depending on where you are inside of the organization, there are absolutely grassroots way of helping to solve some developer experience challenges, and there's ways of trying to bubble that up. One of the biggest challenges that I see collectively in this space is that a lot of leadership, and especially in the kind of the CFOs of the world, still look at developer experience as a cost center, not as an investment. And by kind of focusing in on that waste and friction and saying, look, like, this is the thing that's bothering us, that's slowing down this process. This is what it's costing me. And by thinking about it from that way and building and shaping metrics that can help paint that picture, will start to drive change. And I'll finish with like the old kind of Chinese adage of, when's the best time to plant a tree? 25 years ago is the right answer. The second best answer is today. And I look at developer experience like planting a tree. You have to nurture it. You have to think about it. You have to be empathetic. You have to help understand and solve people's problems in a really meaningful way. And that will start to grow and grow and grow and grow. And all of a sudden you might get 2, 3, 4 years down the road and look back and go, wow, like, we have come a long way. And it didn't feel like it was some gigantic lift, because you changed your culture and that changed the way that you think about it. And that, to me, is the way that you really go about kind of driving and changing things from a developer experience perspective.
Well, Chris, I have a huge list of questions that I was not even able to get to. I think we may have to do a round 2 for this, but I think let's wrap it up here. So thank you so much for that. This was a great conversation. And hopefully this is great for the listeners as well. I will share some of the things that you mentioned also in the show notes. But thank you so much for your time. And great to have you here on our podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. More than happy to come back anytime.